Packet pushers.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of security and networking. I'm JJ, here with, as always, the Drew, and today we have our guest, Scott Robohn, the founder and principal consultant of TSC and co-founder of AutoCon Conference. He's also the host of Total Network Operations Podcast, which is a new podcast on the Packet Pushers Network, and you can find that at packetpushers.net. And today we're talking about SecOps. So we're going to be talking to Scott about some perspectives on the convergence of teams and the tasks between network operations and security operations. We're going to get into some of the complexity involved in that and operationalizing that, a little bit on the free-spirited hippie packets and what they need out of the world versus the security, maybe not. But in all seriousness, we have a great conversation around organizational structures, and Scott has an interesting idea about how to bring these teams together from an architecture standpoint and operational standpoint. So we'll jump right in. All right, Scott, let's start with definitions. So what do we mean by NetOps and SecOps, and what are the roles, responsibilities, and tasks associated with these?
I'm really not trying to be a very pointed definition. When I think of NetOps here, I'm just talking about the basic operations of a network, and largely from a traditional networking perspective, not mostly cloud, not necessarily heavily automated and heavily DevOpsy. Those elements could come in, but think of the basic functions of the network infrastructure. There's a design, it's been built, it's in service. Operations is all about handling the issues as they come up, like outages and other less severe incidents, care and feeding of the network elements, NOS upgrades, equipment refreshes, and so forth, and just keeping it up and running, doing incremental builds and adds over time. That's what I'm thinking about when I think about NetOps.
Are we saying NOS? Is that a thing? Because I'm just like, NOS upgrades, dude. It's like totally gnarly. It's Saturday and we're like doing our NOS upgrades. So they're ready for Monday.
Totally. Dude, did you upgrade your NOS? Oh, you should see this NOS. Yes, it's in my vocabulary. I feel like it's a hit or miss.
Do you say ACL? Do you also say ACL?
I do not say ACL.
Okay. All right. Well, then we can be friends. We can keep going.
No, and I actually, because of my heavy Juniper indoctrination, I tend to call them firewall filters.
Oh.
Because we couldn't call them ACLs because of that other vendor. So.
All right, Drew, we can continue now.
Okay, great.
It was about to be a very short episode.
I'm glad you're allowed to stay, Scott.
Thank you.
Okay, so NetOps, essentially just sort of your day-to-day, keeping the network up and running, doing some basic care and feeding, that kind of thing. And how about SecOps? Do you have a take on the sort of general roles, responsibilities, and tasks on the security side?
The big differentiator there, in my view, is incident response, right? When you've got something that you know is an issue, and I'm sure we're continue to beat the CrowdStrike, Windows thing to death here, but that was clearly a security incident, and all the forensics and all the, immediate remediation, and then figuring out, okay, what happened and why, that all fits in the SecOps arena. And I can even step back a little bit and kind of give you a little background on why I'm curious about this. So from some of the work I'm doing on the other podcast that's coming out, Total Network Operations, I've really thought about how different disciplines around the network need to be thought about holistically. And IP networking and security definitely need tight coordination. And when I heard JJ talking about this in her podcast description, I thought, kindred spirit, this should be a great conversation. And not having the deep security background and involvement, or having for years, I need other people to complement what that looks like from the security side. So JJ, that was like the number one reason I was interested in talking to you about this.
Yeah. And conversely, I think I'm always interested. So, came from the networking side for many years, but there has been a lot of advancements in automation and just network operations and streamlining those processes and new toolings and things since I've been heavily involved in it. So yeah, super awesome kumbaya moment here, and a great way to launch the new podcast too.
Yeah, so the thrust of the discussion is why integrate NetOps and SecOps. So Scott, you're here to make the argument. What is the argument for a NetSecOps organization if we're just going to cram all these terms together?
Right. I would start by arguing from first principles. If you take your IT system as a holistic system that needs to deliver services, it's just good common sense on making sure the piece parts are operating together correctly. And that's a huge ecosystem, right? We're just talking about two small important pieces, but network and security operations are only part of something much bigger. So there's always benefits to be had by making sure we understand how things work together. In this conversation, if we just zoom in on network and security, like how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And I'm not advocating the eating of elephants in any way, shape, or form. But every large problem is composed of smaller subproblems. There are more eloquent ways to say that, I'm sure. But that's kind of where I start. I also, as I've dug into this with lots of other conversations in the past 6 months, there's this whole idea of workflow and process engineering that I think impacts, what we do to operate our whole IT infrastructure. And I'm biased, industrial engineering background as an undergrad. Since you don't really take circuits courses or learn how to program as an industrial engineer, you've got to find some way to execute, your version of being an engineer control freak. So, looking at workflow and process, it's a way of coordinating what gets done across all those IT disciplines. And that, of course, impacts what's happening with security and with the network. Another thing that I would point to here is there are certain roles in the network that just lend themselves to convergence of network and security. If you think about branch routers, whether it's a branch office, whether it's a retail outlet, those are often firewalls with really good routing capability. Right? You've got to have that protection built in. So that kind of drives convergence of those issues. There's the eternal debate. Do I want a router with good firewall capabilities? Do I want a firewall with good routing capabilities? JJ, you're snickering.
You usually get one or neither. It tends to never be both in one package. Anyway, I'll stop snickering at that. But yes, it's a challenge for sure.
And look, I think the vendor space, some have done a good job with that, some have not, right? I survived the combination of NetScreen into Juniper. Some of that integration was pretty bumpy and did not go very well. And the existence of Palo Alto today, you could consider that's evidence for people being very dissatisfied with that integration of security features into Junos.
On the other hand, I'm going to challenge that the NetScreen solution was a pretty solid and easy to manage firewall, whereas taking a routing operating system that didn't have firewall capabilities and then shoving it into a firewall and making everybody use that initially was probably not the best path.
Oh, I would say preach, sister.
Sorry, I'm saucy today,
So I would fundamentally say if you take a router that's designed to be a big, dumb, scalable packet forwarding machine that's not required to maintain state, right? And then you put all this stuff in it that says, hey, I'd like you to maintain state now. Firewall capability, stateful firewall was some of the stuff that was put in there. Also from the carrier space, the broadband network gateway, BNG capability, also very state heavy, were requirements that were put into an operating system that was never designed for that. And that was a bumpy road, right? I saw it as a TAC engineer, and I saw it as an SE and an SE leader. So,
and Drew, we don't want to call out specific SRX products here, but
It happened again.
I was being good. I was being good to not mention the NOS name or the product names. I was trying hard. So.
Everybody knows who we're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
But Scott, I feel like with that metaphor you just made about Juniper's problems with the NetScreen is the problem we're facing here. You want to move packets as fast as possible, but then security comes along and wants to say, stop what you're doing. We need to maintain state. We need to check things. We got to slow this down or at least be able to inspect. And so that very clash that sort of hampered Juniper's acquisition of the NetScreen also seems like an impediment to a NetSecOps integration.
So I would turn that around into a couple different positives. You could have made the design decision from a product perspective to let the products with different engineering heritages be what they were. And you could have had other ways to integrate them, like a management system that did what I needed to do for routing products and then did what I needed to do for security products. We've seen other vendors do that. And I understand the value in that. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? There are other ways to integrate it. I do love the way you called out how, in one sense, networking and security are completely at odds with each other, right? Packets want to be free, baby.
Yeah, man.
The network's supposed to deliver all the packets. Network operators want to deliver all the packets.
With no judgment.
So we've got Woodstock and we've got Men in Black.
Yes, just look at the flashy thingy right here. And I would argue that those two cross purposes are really one of the reasons you need to be highly coordinated, because what you really want to do is deliver all the right packets.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well played. So is that sort of then the underlying argument for NetSecOps is it's about delivering the right packets?
Yeah, I hadn't put it in those terms until about 17 minutes ago, but I think that's an interesting way of putting it.
So this leads into one of the points you've got in the doc that we're all working from here is it's essentially about a common understanding of an issue. Is this a network problem? Is this a security problem? How do we know? How do we find out? How can we solve that problem together quickly?
Yes, incident response for sure. I don't like to use the T word trauma lightly, but I think anybody from a network engineering perspective is used to being blamed. It's usually, oh, it's the network. And how many different characterizations of the CrowdStrike problem have you heard being a global internet outage? It was not a global internet outage. I work on a Mac and I don't use CrowdStrike. And I was fine that day. My Twitter feed blew up at 4:30 in the morning Eastern time. But I was like, okay, it's not my fault. So we're used to having this defensive position. And JG, I would put that to you. Do you have the same attitudes in the security world, or is it not as traumatic for you?
I mean, I think definitely coming because I came from, network security architecture first. So that was a lot of
Sure.
moving the packets around. But from the security standpoint, it's been pretty similar in that when something isn't working, it's what did we do that's making this not work suddenly for me? Right. Like, what kind of tool do you have? Our email security is not working, or this isn't working, or that's not working. The EDR is doing this thing, and they're not wrong at that point. Right. So maybe a little bit different, maybe not as much trauma. It's just being at the mercy of other people's problems, like the CrowdStrike thing.
Yeah, I would say my perception is that the security perspective is we warned you this would happen.
Hmm.
And we told you and you didn't listen.
Can you flesh that out a little bit?
Sure. So we run our vulnerability scanner every month and it prints out a list of 1,000 vulnerabilities, and we don't have the time or the resources to patch them all and fix them. And so we have to sign off statements saying, are you willing to accept the risk that comes from not providing the resources or time we need to patch these vulnerabilities, right? And then something goes wrong and they're like, oh, it was a security exploit. What happened? You security people, and you're like, here's the email or the document you signed off on saying I accept this risk.
Yeah, but we're screwed both ways because if you don't do something, then you have an issue eventually. If you do something and you're one of the people, not to pick on CrowdStrike, but that was the situation, so I'm going to mention them, right?
Mhm.
You're getting your automated updates to make it more secure. They push the signature down, it impacts the kernel, and 8.5 million Windows devices go offline for an hour and a half.
Right. Oops.
So I guess it's we warned you and we can't win.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's why we drink a lot in security. And I'm kind of joking because I made a post on LinkedIn about, alcohol and events and stuff. But no, I do. I think it's hard emotionally sometimes because there are times, especially when you're lower down with the hands-on, where you feel like you can't win. Because when you're
Right.
doing your job and things are locked, air quoting, locked down, the users are complaining about something or some other integration stops working. And then when it's not secured, you've got a whole long other list of problems you have to deal with.
Yep.
Every discipline probably has the feeling like they're the underappreciated ones, but the networking team, I think, could also say the same thing. If the network's running fine, nobody notices.
Right.
Nobody even knows networking exists until something breaks, and then it's like, you stupid network engineers. They also can't win.
As a TAC engineer, nobody ever called me or opened a case to thank me for keeping the internet up. I only heard from my customers when there was a problem.
We're going to send you flowers next week, Scott, for keeping the internet up.
Chocolate, dark chocolate, highly preferred.
Oh, man.
This episode is turning into a pity party. We got to move on.
Yeah, no, sorry. Not trying to drag down into the mire here, but just important context.
Very important. So if we are to bring NetOps and SecOps together, one place to start maybe is tools. Are there tools that they might use to have in common that could sort of be an organizational point, a focal point for this integration?
Yeah, I think automation is a huge opportunity there. And again, I don't want to treat security too monolithically. I gravitate toward the network firewall and things that directly impact connectivity and traffic on the network. I know security is much broader than that.
Mhm.
But for devices that have configurations, if I'm using GitHub to manage all my device configs for my switches and my routers, I should be able to also do that from my firewalls. If I have good processes for checking config changes and making sure they go out at a time, could be a maintenance window, maybe not necessarily a maintenance window, but common processes for making changes to my network firewalls and my routers and switches. That should be another piece of commonality. And why reinvent the wheel, right? And I don't personally care whether it's taking process from what we've done on the security side and apply it to network changes, or the other way around, or some hybrid, right? But coordination and having the minimum number of rules and regs to operate your infrastructure probably makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
I agree with that in principle, and I'm always trying to kind of think about how some of this gets operationalized from having just worked in a lot of environments with a lot of different people in different industries and different teams. I mean, there's so many organizations where there is such a silo between security and networking and in the org chart, right? The structure and the reporting structure, the budgets, it's not an inconsequential thing to say, hey, share tooling.
Right.
Even though it sounds like really easy and it's like, well, no brainer. And then I also kind of think, well, two things. I think all technical professionals, we collectively fall into the trap of we always feel like we have more to do than we can possibly do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to take a breath and step back from something, feel like you're moving backwards or not moving forward, and readjust, re-architect, replan, whatever that means, right? Dealing with change management, processes, workflows, tooling. But then there's just the reality that I think the security team and the networking team, as they have been, have such different goals in what they're doing that the tools that they use and how they use them, the views, the reports and stuff have been not overlapping in meaningful ways. What are your thoughts about that?
So I think one size does not fit all, right? And we always have to be mindful of that. I kind of look at this as well, let's come up with a default position and then deviate from it as needed, right? And if I'm looking for specific reporting on security issues, whether they be incidents or routine reports, that's fine. Use the tools that are what you need to deliver business value, right? And that should probably be the number one discriminator there. I don't usually need that kind of reporting from the network. Now, I care more about our circuits being overutilized. Do I need to upgrade capacity in certain places? The security team obviously has a much more granular level of reporting that needs to be done on certain things. I'm not trying to plaster it all over and make it all the same, but more coordination and more commonality where it can be had, I think it's a good thing.
How about logs and alerts as a sort of common touch point for these orgs?
My sense is with what's happening with AI tools, that seems like that's probably going to be a really interesting area to ingest all sorts of logs, alerting from SIM tools, from the network layer, and be able to correlate. Here's an event that happened. I have security logs generated. I have network logs generated. How do I reduce that down to here's root cause, here's what's happened. Do I need to worry about it or not? And I speak largely from the networking side. With all the advances in telemetry, we've created our own big data problem without even considering security logs. I can stream telemetry with the best of them now, as long as the devices can actually, handle it without falling over. And it's beyond, human and cognitive load limits, right? I need tools to be able to reduce and correlate. I would think that that would be a prime area to connect dots between the two domains, through reporting and log ingest. JJ, what do you think?
Yeah, I actually have a slightly different question because you got me thinking. Again, this is one of those areas where there are lots of organizations that, the networking team or whoever manages some subset of the infrastructure.
Right.
Could be endpoints, could be servers, could be, right. They each have their own whatever for logging and alerting. And then it's, if you have a security organization as well, now they want you to also send certain logging and alerting into that. And you just end up with this crazy sprawl. And it's fragmented because typically what's happening within the group who understands how to manage and maintain that system or that infrastructure is getting higher fidelity alerts about the things that they care about.
Right.
But then they're usually just like sending random logging into the security organization that may not have what they need that would be indicative of an immediate alert to respond for an incident, right?
Right.
But I had a question for you around coming from the technical side, right? Over the years, because you've been doing this longer than I have, I feel like there was a time when, as an engineer doing technology stuff on networks, we had our heads wrapped around a lot of different technologies at once.
Right.
We did switch, we did route, we did firewall, later we did wireless. Like we did all of these things.
Hmm.
And I feel like more recently we've gotten to this point where each of those things is so freaking complicated that you're talking about, and I'm not picking on any one vendor here, but whether it's, Cisco or Aruba or whoever or Juniper, that, certain parts of their solutions, the training for an engineer to just get an admin level, the low level technical knowledge is, 4 days. And then if you want more knowledge, it's another 4 days. And then if you want expert knowledge, it's probably a couple more weeks for one platform. And so I'm kind of curious, like, I have feelings in my head about what has to happen with the industry. I'm curious what you're saying about the complexity curve here and what's going to happen, because we can't keep letting that be that complex when we're saying we need to merge tools and teams and processes.
Yeah. I would say it was bad enough in the 90s. And it's only gotten more complex. And so some of those impressions from my early career, I was a Cisco instructor, worked for a Cisco training partner before I went completely vendor side. And the batches of technologies or the groupings of technologies, enterprise folks had the networking stuff they focused on, and service provider and carrier folks focused on their own different things. And I would, even back at that point in internet development, I always felt like the enterprise folks had to have a better handle of understanding security, and especially ports and protocols from the get-go, whereas many of the carrier and SP focused folks were really occupied with BGP and other, core routing technologies and all the bells and whistles that have been added on via many RFCs over the decades. So, okay, Scott, stop complaining. What are you going to do about it? Great question. I'm glad you asked. You have to have this balance of specialization, but also people will understand how it all fits together. And I don't know if this is the best way to think about it, but I think there's room for an operations architect. And I've been thinking of it primarily in the networking realm, but somebody who's in the ops organization, who's not in the architecture team, who lives and dies with the ops team, that kind of has that master plan. Doesn't necessarily need to know how to configure every device in the network, security, route, switch, otherwise, but it could be a person. It could be a couple people with that responsibility. I'm kind of a Moneyball guy. There's not one way to implement all this as long as I have the right skills on the team. Figuring out where that slider bar is between having the right differentiation, but also knowing how it all works together. There's a balance to be struck there. On this topic, a couple of interesting conversations that I've had with MSPs and MSSPs that are usually attached to VARs, they definitely wrestle with this because not only, you think in a single enterprise network, you may have a subset of security and networking vendors and technologies that you deal with, but a VAR, and an MSSP associated with that VAR might do 100 different Snowflake networks and have to know all the firewall NOSes. I'm just going to make fun of that the rest of the call here. There's so many different piece parts to know as an MSSP that they really wrestle with this topic, right? How do I build the right pockets of expertise? I can't necessarily expect a security engineer to be equally proficient in 4 different firewall operating systems, right? So they're actively struggling with this. Okay, how do I write all my common tooling that has multi-tenancy for the MSSP to be able to address different networks with different entitlement, with different vendors and so forth? That's a real issue. I don't pretend to have understood the depths of it, but JJ, you're definitely onto something there.
Yeah. And coming from a VAR for 20 years who also did MSSP stuff, and we managed, many different types of firewalls and switches and routers and Wi-Fi, and it's a lot.
But the flip side of that, just to call out a little silver lining, man, what an opportunity to learn so many different pieces of the networking and security puzzle. As I've been digging into this, over the last year, my respect for people in the VAR and MSP and MSSP space has just skyrocketed. I thought it was hard enough when I just had a subset of network elements that I needed to support and then sell. These people have to be all over it and just, be living and breathing, Swiss Army knives.
Yeah. I think for listeners, one of the things I tell people is it's definitely not for everybody. It's not everybody's cup of tea. But yeah, the amount of exposure you get to different technologies and different architectures and different people and teams and how they work within the org structure, like with an integrator or reseller of our or whatever, you get your fingers in so much stuff and you are always in somebody else's network. Like you're walking in the door and you might have worked in this environment before, or this might be a brand new client and this is your first project with them. It's just constant learning, and it's fun when you're in that learning mode. It's a lot of work if you're at the point in your life where you're just like, you don't want to work that hard and you don't want to think that much and you don't want to keep learning new things. It can get exhausting, but my God, it's like a superpower pellet when you're playing a video game, right? It just pushes you so far past everything else you could possibly do for a job.
That the mushrooms in Mario, is there something about eating?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Not really literate in Super Mario, but I knew there was some connection there. So I get it.
Yeah.
So one thing I feel like we haven't really nailed down yet is what is the value of this integration between NetOps and SecOps? What is the value to the organization? What is the value to the network team and the security team? Are there maybe some scenarios you can use to sort of illustrate how that value would play out, Scott?
Yeah. So again, not to overuse CrowdStrike as an example, but from an outbound perspective, clear customer communications. Like you have the ability to marshal resources quickly. If you're like, I don't know if it's a security issue or a networking issue, let's make sure we have everybody on this or the right amount of resource on this right away to be able to communicate rapidly. And that customer facing value is really important. And you saw some of the heartburn on maybe some of the miscommunication around the CrowdStrike discussion. That was a month ago at this point, wasn't it?
Yes.
But there's that outbound communication aspect. And I've actually had a couple people who have seen some discussion on total network operations ask that we dive into that specifically. So that's a simple answer to that question, but there's definitely more to it. And the how is important that I'll definitely be digging into. From an internals perspective, again, I'll draw back on let's use common tooling where we can and maybe pay less in licensing fees, for different tools. If I can consolidate the number of tools for certain infrastructure things where it makes sense. Again, hearing JJ's comment in the back of my head, sometimes the security team needs different things, not trying to clip anybody's wings here, but save cost on common infrastructure where possible. That's a tangible benefit.
How would you see a converged team handle something like incident response?
Somebody's going to be on pager duty at an outage, but they're not pagers anymore. I know I'm still stuck on,
Some people have pagers. I have friends who have pagers. That's the
Really?
thing. Yes.
Well, I just thought it was the coolest thing when we got the first Blackberries. That was like, I must be really important. I was important when I had a pager. I mean, let me do a sidebar here and tell a pager story. So working for a telco in the mid 90s, I very clearly remember my first, Sunday 2 a.m. maintenance window. And there was a leader who was known for his tough style. And he visited everybody working the maintenance that weekend, handing out AA batteries for your pager. And he basically said, if I page you and you don't respond, don't come in on Monday. He didn't work there much longer after that.
Batteries as a threat.
That's right.
You have no excuse. Yeah.
Sorry, what was the real question, Drew?
The real question is, how would you envision a NetSecOps team handling something like incident response?
The first responders should have network and security skills, right? There should be enough to do that initial triage. It doesn't mean you need the most highly skilled engineer from a security or a network engineering perspective, but put the resources on it right away to make rapid triage. And then you can route the issue to the more detailed resources as quickly as possible. But having folks with the expertise up front to be able to diagnose correctly can really lead to rapid resolution and better communication. Because this is Packet Protector, we're talking about security and network coordination. There's way more that we could throw into this mix too. I think the optical layer, for networking is another technology domain that's just like ships in the night with IP that we could still do a better job, coordinating with. I don't want to confuse this conversation too much, but again, have enough access to the right smarts right away to do really rapid triage.
I have a question about like just functionally how this works. So there's network operations, there's security operations, which in most organizations is going to be whatever they have that's going to be doing at a minimum incident response, but probably, SOC analysts, dealing with escalations, et cetera.
Yep.
So you have those two teams that are traditionally completely separated. Although I will caveat that with, we are starting to see requests in help clients. The CISO is now responsible for infrastructure and they're trying to figure out how to deal with that. So that's happening. But typically there's two different structures, two different orgs, people, teams, budgets. And now sometimes, depending on the size of the organization and the industry that they're in, there might be an architect. So you might have, network architects on that side. You might have security architects on the security side. How do you envision this? Like either taking the pieces and the resources and the people that an organization has now, or like you kind of mentioned, even having a operational architect, which is not a technical architect, but more of a process, right? Architect, I think, if I understood. So how do you envision companies like assuming mixing and matching that they do or don't have certain resources? Where are you thinking in your head? How does this fit together?
I think that ops architect role is kind of a belly button, right? They need to have direct line of communication with the network architect or the security architect, security architecture team, know enough, be responsible for having good documentation from source of truth and what we think is supposed to be implemented. So somebody within the ops organization has enough of the right information to move rapidly, but know who to pull in the event that, hey, I just don't understand why you configured the network this way or why you wrote those firewall filters that way, not ACLs, firewall filters. And that comes down to, you talk about the organizational problem, right? Or organizational challenges. There's got to be agreement on you have permission to call these people in the middle of the night if you have to, right? Minimize that by having great documentation and making it available and keeping it refreshed. And of course, we all know that's super easy to do, right?
Network engineers love making documentation.
No, it's like the cop. You know how much I hate writing paperwork?
Yeah.
Network engineers are the same way, right?
Just going to give you a warning this time, ma'am, because I don't feel like doing the paperwork. Said nobody to me ever, just by the way.
You're making it up. I'm sure you're not speaking from experience, right?
Yeah. So then would this structure be under the CISO's team, the CIO's team? Is this a new entity that's kind of parallel or lateral that doesn't have authority? How do we do this?
That's a great question. I don't have a direct answer for that today. Your comment that CISO's getting more responsibility for infrastructure is interesting. I would certainly entertain that. What are the implications if we put all this infrastructure under the security responsibility? I mean, there's more than one way to make things like this work, as long as there's common understanding, who's responsible for what. My default would be it should probably be somewhere in the CIO office, right? And then I don't want to be too prescriptive on exactly how to organize it. There's always the issue of, do you try to go in and implement something completely new that's at odds with the way we've been organized for the past 17 years? Or do you try to get things done through incremental change? I lean towards incremental change. Sometimes wholesale change is really hard to swallow, but again, that's an it depends. I cite that as the first law of network engineering. It depends.
Scott, I mean, we've kind of touched on a few of the things that we all have to figure out. And I'd probably just go ahead and say that I don't foresee this as a single model that works for everybody, just like the CISO in some orgs reports directly up to CEO. Sometimes they report to COO or CFO, and then sometimes they report to the CIO. And I think this would probably be the same thing. You just figure out who has the authority and the resources, and then you make it work.
Yep.
But what about like other hurdles like culture, mindset? Because, typically we have personalities that we kind of associate with, certain types of people in network engineering and certain types of people in security. And what does that look like?
I think there is a clearly identifiable cultural issue, at least in the network engineering ranks, of hero culture. And I have a little rant on this. I'll try to keep it short here. But in the build out of the internet, starting from the mid 90s, maybe even early 90s, depending on where you inserted, people who could do, without any formal education and could just open up manuals and make it work, that was a superpower. And with the incredible commercial growth of the internet, that's a lot of how we got it done. That was great for a certain phase of development. Now, 30 years later, we have business continuity requirements, we have availability requirements, and so forth. And getting the hero culture and the people who want to hold on to, well, I've always been the person to do this. And don't worry, you page me, I'll get it done. That's bad organizationally, and it's bad for that individual. Finding ways to spread that responsibility around and having a little more open communication and better documentation on things. That's certainly a cultural issue that I think is still very present in the network engineering world. I know we're not the only ones to suffer from it. As we were prepping for this, I said, I got to ask JJ what she thinks on the security side on this topic.
I think that we have a lot of personalities. And frankly, I think coming from a highly technical field, we have a lot of egos that we're dealing with too. And I'm putting myself, 20 years as a network architect for security, I'm going to put myself in that bucket too. I think more recently in my life, I think about things a little bit differently. I approach problems differently. But I think it is hard to break out of that because, I could go off on a rant here. I'm not going to. But one of the conversations from a session that I do and some other stuff that I do is, getting from practitioner to leader or manager and what that means. And it's basically most of us have spent our personal and professional lives identifying as an engineer in one way or another. I learned binary when I was 8, and I spent most of my 20s with an entire lab throughout my house that cost more than my house did. Right. Like firewalls, packet shapers, switches, like everything there, whole enterprise network in my house, sitting there doing labs till 3 o'clock in the morning to understand the technology and figure it out. And that then becomes who you are. And that's how you identify value, like your value to yourself and your value to the organization and the world.
Right.
And I think to then be in a situation where suddenly you feel like you're not delivering that value because you've been expected to know everything and solve every problem, that to then walk into another team or with another person whose knowledge and experience is going to eclipse you in some areas, always. You're never going to be the smartest person in the room about everything. That's sorry, people. If you think you are, you're either in the wrong room or you're delusional. I don't know where this happened in our industry, but it frustrates me that we're supposed to know everything. And so when we're trying to learn new stuff, we don't ask questions. We're not vulnerable. We don't just go, you know what, I've never had to deal with this, or I did, but I don't remember what we did. Or I'm sorry, what does that acronym mean?
Right.
And just opening up, like, I think that's hard. I think it's hard for security professionals, and I think it's hard for traditional network engineers. Personally, one of my life goals is to break that stigma and that barrier, make it okay to ask questions and make it okay to not know everything. And I think one of the valuable part in what we can do sometimes is not have the answers, but either know where to go find them or know the right questions to ask.
Right. This is where I invoke the Office meme, with Dwight asks Jim, do you want to form an alliance? Around this issue, get out of my head. That whole culture of fear of asking the wrong question because I don't want to look like an idiot. I mean, that was my early TAC engineer experience. I knew that there were escalation engineers watching every question that went back and forth from the entire global TAC organization. And if I asked the question the wrong way or indicated that I, in fact, did not read the fine manual, the fantastic manual, I was about to be delivered a new one, so to speak. And I think it's a leadership responsibility to create an environment where it's okay to ask questions. Think about the benefits, right? You get to resolution of an issue much more quickly. You don't have goofy network engineers afraid to type the question or take 3 hours to create the email so they can ask the question exactly the right way without getting flamed. I think it's a huge issue, and it does take intentionality in an organization to make that okay.
Amen, brother.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is that step one, if you're going to look at integrating NetOps and SecOps, is take both teams out, get them some therapy, or maybe do an ayahuasca ceremony or something.
I'm a big fan of walking meetings. Like, just go for a walk around the pond or, whatever the closest body of water. You solve more and you get some vitamin D.
Get everybody out of the environment they're all comfortable in, make them go for a walk. I could see that, yeah.
I'm a huge fan. Yep.
Yes. I don't know is a perfectly reasonable answer.
Right. We need to make that okay.
I got a job because I was able to say that. I was interviewing for that Cisco instructor position, and I was asked a question about long fat pipes. What happens with TCP over satellites? And I had never, ever encountered that before. And the answer was, caveated, I don't know, but I'll get back to you. And they basically said, yeah, we want people who are going to be able to admit that they don't know everything. And it worked out for me in that one instance. So.
Yeah. I do think it always works out, especially when that's the truth.
Yep.
And if you add the caveat, I will go to find out, or let us find out together, or something to that effect. Yes.
Yep.
All right. There's obviously a lot to chew on here and think about, but Scott, any final thoughts? How should people be thinking about this?
So obviously we're just scratching the surface along lots of vectors here of ways that we can build better coordination between networking and security teams. this is something that I'm actively pursuing. I view total network operations as kind of a research project. I've been chastised by Ned Belvance. I can't say best practices anymore, but I can go discover really good ideas. So, instead of trying to just create a top-down framework, I've decided let's talk to people who are in the trenches and surface how they're doing things like this. So as I get to engage in these really interesting conversations, just like this today with you two, I want to use that as a body of knowledge to say, well, here's how a couple different organizations have dealt with these, silo coordination issues and how they've made it better for them, and not necessarily be prescriptive, but say, here's something you can consider, here's something you could try. So that's kind of my mission with Total Network Operations.
And Total Network Operations is the latest podcast in the Packet Pushers podcast fleet, armada. I don't know what metaphor to use.
The galaxy of stars.
Galaxy of stars.
The Playtone galaxy of stars. So
yeah, so go check it out. All right, let's get into some news then. Let's move on to the news section of this recording. And Scott, you're welcome to hang out and chime in as you like. I'll lead us off. First, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, has released the first 3 standards for post-quantum encryption, or PQE. NIST says the algorithms specified in the standards are ready to use today and are designed to withstand cryptographic attacks by quantum computers. Of the 3 standards, one's aimed at general encryption and the other 2 are designed for protecting digital signatures. How do we feel about this?
How worried are we about the advent of quantum computers?
I'm worried.
How soon do you think? I don't want to sound like, don't worry about it until it's too late. That's a bad approach.
I think this is the thing, right? I think there's 2 forks. There's 2 prongs to 1 fork. I don't know how forks work, but anyway, there's 2 things here. There's the quantum computing isn't here yet. We don't need to worry about it. Deal with this later. We have bigger fish to fry, dragons to slay before that's a problem for us. And I think that's valid for a lot of use cases and for a lot of use cases in certain organizations. But we have a lot of data that is going to be vulnerable if it's decrypted later. So certain medical records, financial information, things like that, where if somebody's collecting or harvesting that data now and they just store it and they tuck it away like little chipmunk cheeks, and then they have access to quantum computers later and they decrypt that, there are certain use cases, data sets, industries where that will be a problem. And so I think it makes sense if we have these algorithms available to us now to go ahead and start using them, because we are making hardware, we're making chipsets, we're putting IoT things out in the world. We're not going to have the opportunity to touch some of those things again before this is an issue for us.
I can heartily agree with you on that point, especially with, the rate of deployment of IoT devices. Get stronger encryption options in those devices now, because first the algorithms, then implementation, which is going to be part software and part hardware. Then there'll be testing and certification, right? These need to make it into the FIPS 140-3 suite. And the analysis on the, approval for use for getting devices like this in government networks, it takes a long time. So you talked me into this. I'll back off my quantum computing is all hype.
And they did. Oh, actually, Drew, what was the episode we had where we talked about post-quantum?
Episode 12.
Episode 12, people, go back. I think we had a great conversation then several weeks ago about what it means and why we need to get ready. So we've had the algorithms. They've been kind of being put under a microscope and beat up for a while. So it is actually, when NIST codified these, I think there's 4 total, 3 of them, this announcement, are FIPS 203, 204, and 205. That is it now. That is the final standard. And that literally just happened in the past, like 48 hours from the time we're recording now. And I think that last one is coming in later this year. So why not?
Sure.
Why not at least go ahead and have this at the ready? If you're making equipment, if you're an OEM, why not go ahead and have hardware that's capable of this? I'm going to rewind for a second and take a little trip down memory lane and remember, like, when Wi-Fi first came out, and this is fresh in my mind because I just taught this class this week, we had RC4, which was just complete rubbish out of the gate. And then we knew that we had AES coming. And, back then Wi-Fi was like onesie twosie. The APs were really expensive. We weren't buying them in hundreds and thousands. People had just gotten this brand new technology. They weren't going to get rid of it or trade it back. Like, it didn't, we didn't really have those options. You were stuck with it. So we had TKIP as an interim stopgap because we had all of these access points and endpoints who could only do RC4. They didn't have the processing power for AES. We shoved TKIP in there as a stopgap. And so I would like to see us not be in that situation when we have control over it at this point.
And to add insult to injury, there will be what happens after we have quantum computers. This is a never ending battle, right?
Yeah.
And to pause at any point, you really caused me to rethink my snarky initial comments here. I
Oh.
appreciate this.
The fact that these PQE algorithms were designed to work against quantum computers and also against sort of attacks by classical computers, that's great. They can be dual use. They don't require special hardware. They can run on existing CPUs and ASICs. They might take up some more memory, but it's not like we all have to use something new to put these out and start rolling them out and integrating them into our encryption system. So I do think JJ's right. We should just start. We should get started. Yes, I don't think there's a significant threat from quantum computers just yet, but it's probably coming someday. And these algorithms can be used just for day-to-day use as well. So why not start trying to integrate and roll them out now that they've gone through the NIST process? They've been banged on. We have to worry about making sure they're implemented properly, but let's do it now before it's an emergency.
Right.
All right, moving on. Microsoft has announced a remote code execution vulnerability in its TCP/IP stack. It only affects Windows systems supporting IPv6, but v6 is default enabled on Windows. This is according to Bleeping Computer. Remote attackers can trigger a buffer overflow by sending specially crafted packets via IP6, and blocking IPv6 on the host firewall isn't an option because apparently the vulnerability gets triggered before being processed by the firewall. Microsoft has rated this as a critical vulnerability.
Ouch.
JJ's laughing.
I know. I'm sorry. I feel like I've been giggling so much during this episode. I'm trying to giggle quietly away from the microphone. Yeah, Microsoft just can't catch a break this month. And this is not the first remote code execution, high criticality thing we've seen from them in the past several weeks. Now, one thing I am interested to dig more into this and maybe, so again, we talked about IPv6 with Scott Hogue, several weeks ago. And one of the things he said during that was, just disabling it in Windows in particular, he was talking about, doesn't actually disable it, doesn't keep it from working. So I'm a little bit curious to dig more into this with somebody who knows and kind of maybe do a follow-up later of what does disabling it entail and mean, and what depth of protection is that going to give people? If Microsoft is saying you can disable it and that solves the problem, that's great. But just based on their response to several other high criticality RCEs recently, where they just really didn't disclose anything and it was kind of like, don't worry about it, we're patching it. It makes me almost kind of question the fact of this guidance of, can you really just disable it in the operating system and solve the problem or not?
Yeah, it sounds like a patch is available, and I think that's probably the better way to
Yeah.
go than just trying to go and disable IPv6.
Yeah, I would patch for sure.
All right, last story for the day. TechCrunch, this is a good story. They wrote about a security researcher who managed to turn the tables on some ransomware games. This researcher, his name is Vangelis Stikas, examined the command and control servers of more than 100 ransomware and cyber extortion gangs, and he discovered some basic security flaws in the attacker's own infrastructure, as well as exploits that he could use against the attackers that allowed him to help victims recover. For instance, he was able to provide decryption keys to 2 companies without the need for those companies to pay a ransom, and he was able to warn 4 other companies about impending attacks, and they were able to protect themselves before the criminals could begin encrypting files. Stikas reported on his research at the 2024 Black Hat Conference in Vegas. TechCrunch says one ransomware gang was using default passwords on their backend SQL databases. So I guess even the bad guys need NetSecOps.
It is great to see a good story. I think one of you commented on this, right? Here's some happy accidents, and great that this individual could figure this out. But it's a good thing that the bad guys aren't always that smart.
Right, right. Yes, sometimes I think, particularly in the media, they get hyped up as these super genius criminals, and they're humans just like everybody else.
The one thing that caught my attention, in addition to the technical issues, was the whole law enforcement asks companies to not pay ransom. And I understand the macro problem that they're trying to address, but every individual enterprise who's suffering from an attack like this has their own decisions to make. And I know it's not a technical issue, but it's something I've always scratched my head about. I don't know if there are any good solutions here.
I think their thought process in that is, if we criminalize it to some degree and the ransomware gangs won't go after you because you're not allowed to pay. So frankly, they're just not that discriminating, and they don't know when they're landing on somebody's system who's regulating them and to what degree. So I could argue both sides of it, but I'm with you, Scott, where it's like, I really do think that that's not the right approach and we just need to do a little better. But I did like this story, Drew, because I kind of felt like finally the tables are turned. We've had attackers recently, the past, 12 or 18 months, slide into email strings and slide into Teams and, slip into the DMs and pull data out. And so this researcher was able to access some chat messages from one of the ransomware administrators and get the decryption keys because they were sent in the messaging app.
Yeah, we'll have a link to the story. It's good. You should check it out. And he also presented the research at Black Hat, and we'll link to that as well.
Yeah, good feel good story there.
Yeah, we need a feel good story now and then.
One for the good guys.
All right, well, that wraps up this issue of Packet Protector. Thank you for joining us. You can find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you want more nerdy goodness on networking, wireless cloud, network automation, and total network operations, you can go to packetpushers.net, where you'll find thousands of hours of free technical content for your listening pleasure. You can also hit up JJ and I at packetpushers.net/FU. The FU's for follow-up. We do love your comments, your corrections, clarifications, or just to say hi. Thanks for listening.